Hello, I'm really pleased to introduce Jade Evans, who's going to be talking to us about Pride, the film which I thoroughly enjoyed. So, hello Jade, how are you?
Hello, I'm good, thank you. We're going to be talking about Pride, which came out in 2014, and it was exceedingly popular,
Yes.
probably more so than they thought it would be. And it deals with a group of lesbian and gay activists who support the miners during the miners' strike in 1984 to 1985.
So it is based on this sort of true moment and these real events that happened, though it's a sort of creative interpretation at times.
Yeah, it's a real story. LGSM, who were the lesbians and gays support the miners, they are a real group of people, and they really did go out and support the miners, and the majority of characters in the film are based on real people. Surprisingly, Joe, who is the protagonist, he is the one who is not based on a real character.
Oh, really?
Yep, he's
Okay.
probably the only one, really, who isn't based on a real person.
Okay, so as I say, thoroughly enjoyed this film, but I wondered to what extent does it fit in with sort of British LGBT film history?
Well, I'd say that probably the majority of LGBT plus films are mostly independent. They're kind of funded and distributed by companies like Peccadillo Pictures.
Yeah.
And they don't always get, the screening that they need to kind of become commercially successful or get to the audiences that they need. I mean, with the with on-demand platforms like Netflix, there's quite a lot on there, but for the most part they kind of stay hidden, and even within DVD shops there's always kind of a section specifically for LGBT plus films. Pride was obviously very successful. It won the BAFTA for the outstanding debut by a screenwriter, Stephen Beresford, and it was nominated for Best Outstanding British Film, I believe, as well.
Okay, there's sort of a trend in British cinema of films a bit like Pride, where maybe we focus on British working class people with an LGBT aspect to it.
Yeah, perhaps. We have obviously The Full Monty and Billy Elliot. They're probably the most commercially successful and well-known films about working class industrial disputes. They both have an LGBT aspect to them. In Billy Elliot, you've got his friend who is trans and is possibly homosexual as well. And in The Full Monty, you have two of the characters, Lompe and Guy, who are both homosexual. That's revealed later in the film, but I found that these films kind of skim over it more. So Pride brings it to the surface a little bit more, in that it's more specifically about LGBT activists and kind of their relationship to the working class disputes going on at the time. So for Pride, rather than kind of having any LGBT storyline as a sideline, it brings it more to the surface and makes it kind of the central focus, in that the film is mostly about the solidarity between these two communities.
So this is a film about LGBT activism.
Yeah, I would say that it is. When the characters first meet, it kind of creates a comedy aspect of the film by kind of the jokes that come out about the LGBT characters. For example, Gwen, who's one of the elderly ladies, she kind of shouts to Di, like, "Di, your gears have arrived." And there's this kind of whole, like, the community in Wales is kind of like, I could pronounce it, on the win. They kind of, they're a very close-knit village, and they're kind of not really experiencing anything outside of the village. So whilst they have, gay characters within that, like Cliff, none of them have ever met someone who is openly homosexual. So that's kind of where most of the comedy aspects come from. So there's a thing with Gwen, and I can't remember which character it is that makes a joke about it's Gwen again makes a joke about all gay characters being, or all gay people being vegan or vegetarian. But then when they go to the community centre, when LGSM arrive there, they kind of walk in and the whole room is silent, and they get some shifty looks. The response to them on stage isn't quite it's not as accepting as it is when Di presents on stage in the gay bar in London. But in real life, LGSM in real life recounted about how the response from the mining village was that they went silent at first, but then they got up and all started applauding. because they were just so grateful and so overwhelmed by this community just going out of their way to support them. And that's what the film is about. It's about the support and community through these two different communities uniting. And it's not so much that LGSM necessarily related to the issues of the miners, or that they felt that it was something that maybe directly affected them or anything like that. It was more that they share this common enemy and these common issues of persecution, in that, like Mark says in the film, he's like, we're hit by the public, the government, the police and the tabloid press. So the film is about these groups uniting, and that's kind of epitomised, I think, in the scene where they have the bread and roses.
Yes.
So that kind of follows a moment where Cliff, played by Bill Nighy, is telling Mark and the others about how this Great Atlantic Fault seam links, this mine in Wales with a mine in Pennsylvania, and that, miners from there or Spain or anywhere would recognise it and they kind of identify with it. So there's this kind of sense that, these people who might not share the same language or culture or anything like that, they're kind of linked by their mining community. And then in the film, you kind of have Mark, who is just kind of, like Cliff says, that without the mines, the villages are nothing and finished.
Yeah.
And then you have Mark, who, he kind of looks around the room, all these mining wives and families, and that's what propels him to get up and say, we need to push harder and sometimes you need to attack. And that's then followed by by Bronwyn Lewis's character getting up and singing Bread and Roses, and it's this beautiful moment of solidarity and the link between the characters, the way they look at each other. The whole kind of scene is just beautifully constructed, and there's a real sense of community there. And then obviously this beautiful moment is it goes into the whole kind of aspect of using drama and comedy, or drama and kind of feel good moments, in that you get the two homophobic characters burst in and make homophobic slurs and shout abuse at LGSM. And so that's the whole kind of way that these films work. Same with kind of Full Monty and Billy Elliot, in that they contrast these feel-good moments with drama, and it's kind of a way to make the drama less shocking or less harsh, so that it's not kind of along the lines of a Ken Loach film, but it also kind of works to create the emotional impact as well. And obviously the homophobic slurs and stuff links in with stuff like the AIDS epidemic in the 80s.
Absolutely.
And, which is obviously mentioned later in the film when Joe's kind of brother-in-law makes that comment about the advert on TV and changes it to be anally injected death sentence. So the film kind of deals with its contextual issues as well. But for the characters in the film, community is something that's kind of dealt with throughout. So at the beginning, solidarity is kind of announced from the start, in that you have Mark, who is at the start of the film, he's in his house listening to the news about the miners on TV, and then the guy comes in the room and he's like, oh, I've left my number, and Mark kind of ignores him and instead he just kind of is listening to the news. And there's that moment as well where he goes to get a second cup out the cupboard for assumedly this guy and he doesn't. So there's kind of this issue where he's obviously distracted, and so he's pushing his personal life aside because what is more important to him is this kind of sense of solidarity with the miners, whereas for Joe, who's kind of hiding his homosexuality, there's that moment at the Pits and Perverts ball where he's a photographer and he actually he kind of stops taking the photograph to kind of go into the shadows with that guy and start making out.
So what's quite interesting here is that it's clearly there is these sort of moments of activism on in the LGBT plus level, but also on in terms of the miners' strike. But they have their own different motivations behind it. So both Joe and Mark have very different motivations behind what they're doing, as you suggest.
Yeah.
I suppose it's this idea of the personal and private being political.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's kind of they have two different narratives within the film as well. And for both of them, what is political is something entirely different. But that's kind of all brought to the surface throughout the activism that they do for the mining village. And it's interesting as well in that, I mean, during the 80s, you know, people couldn't donate to any kind of mining fund as such. It wasn't like you could donate to a huge mining support campaign, but you had to kind of focus more on specific communities.
Oh, right. Okay.
So obviously they chose this community in Wales, just bypass all the unions and stuff like that. So they kind of, whilst it's just these tiny communities, I mean, LGSM doesn't stand in for the entire LGBT plus community, and this mining village doesn't stand in for the whole kind of mining community. But the story that is told in this film, it kind of stands in for a broad aspect, and that kind of links in with activism on other levels as well.
Do you think this is an optimistic film then, in terms of not just activism but making a difference just more generally, perhaps?
Yeah, I think the films in kind of the 90s, you know, the Billy Elliot, the Brassed Off, the Full Monty, that kind of stuff, they're much bleaker in terms of tone. They're kind of much darker. I mean, obviously Britain was going through deindustrialisation at the time, and the films are kind of much bleaker in that, like, they don't necessarily end on a positive level. No. So, I mean, whilst the characters all kind of achieve their goals in these films... Has
anything really changed? At the end of these films, I often find...
Full
Monty is my prime example. I mean, by the end of Full Monty, you have this sort of... Yes, they have this successful show, but has anything really changed for their circumstance?
Yeah, well, apparently that's what the kind of screenshot, the kind of snapshot at the end signifies. Or that can be one way that it's read, in that, you know, whilst they've achieved their goal, this snapshot kind of freezes that moment, and it's like, well, they can only make this money once. They can't continue to, you know, keep on kind of using this as a form of employment. And, you know, for Billy Elliot, I mean, whilst Billy goes off and he achieves his goal of being a ballet dancer, his dad and brother are kind of still stuck in this mining community where, you know, the mine is closed, and they don't have any other form of employment. They can't go off and be ballet dancers. And Brassed Off, it has that they win the trophy, but the character Danny in that film, he says that this trophy doesn't really mean anything because, you know, the government has systematically destroyed their industry and their communities. And they kind of have that shot at the end where they're all travelling through the dark on the bus, and it's quite depressing. You know, not the way that Pride... I think for Pride, obviously, it ends the film with this moment of the miners showing their support for the LGBT plus community by joining them on the Pride March, which really happened. And, you know, it's kind of a way to say thank you for all the support that LGSM gave them during the strike. So it's kind of bringing the communities back together, even though the miners' strike is over. The support that these communities showed for one another hasn't ended. And the film has the titles telling you what happened to the characters, you know, after the film, up until, you know, kind of the 30 years later that it, you know, after it kind of was set. So whilst the miners ultimately still lost the fight, and, you know, the last deep coal mine was actually closed a year after Pride came out, just over a year. It actually coincided with LGSM's farewell party that they had to kind of celebrate a year of activism that, you know, they brought into the public sphere. So it was quite bittersweet, really, that it coincided with the same day. But at the end of the film, where it tells you what happened to the real people that the film was based on, whilst the miners lost the fight, they still managed to push forward rights for the LGBT plus community. So it kind of says about, you know, how it was the National Union of Mine Workers had a block vote and kind of supported putting LGBT plus rights into the
Labour Manifesto?
Into the Labour Manifesto, yeah. So in that way, the film kind of deals with how the communities supported one another and actually kind of managed to push rights forward, even though, of course, there were other aspects in making, you know, those rights push forward. But that was one way that, you know, the film had a positive ending.
So it seems to me that this film sort of narrative approach sort of rather reflects the sort of approach it took to its audience as well, in that, you know, we have many different people with shared experiences sort of coming together that might at first glance appear quite different. And it seems to me this film is very like a broad church film. It's definitely trying to appeal to a broad number of people.
Yeah.
And it's not specifically aimed at LGBT audiences, or indeed Welsh minors or audiences here either.
Obviously the film had a huge broad appeal, and I know that some people, some young people in particular, LGBT plus people, they've said that the film has helped them to come out as well.
Oh, fantastic.
So the film is, you know, aside from its huge mainstream appeal, it's also kind of, it's also meant different things to different audiences. And obviously there's the minors, like ex-minors who watch a film and kind of have this nostalgic, you know, remembrance of the past, and in a way, because it's a feel-good film, it's a way of positively remembering the past and using the past, I think, as a way to kind of draw lessons from. Using the past is a way to kind of draw lessons for the present. So for example, the film is about solidarity and activism, and I think that is the primary thing that we get from the film. So after the film, you know, there were audiences all over the world who enjoyed it. So particularly in places like Turkey and even in Russia, where obviously homophobia is a massive deal. So there were also groups who identified with the issues in the film that weren't even born when the miners' strike happened, and you know, they used the kind of activism to be able to set up groups like Lesbians and Gays Support the Dockers and Lesbians and Gays Support the Migrants, which is probably the biggest group that has kind of formed because of the film. So it's young people using the issues that they've gained from the film, learning from the film, and using the lessons that they learn about activism and solidarity, and being able to make positive change, and using them to support issues in contemporary Britain. So obviously you have issues with kind of the right-wing government demonising migrants and the right-wing press, which is exactly what the LGBT and mining communities faced during the 1980s. So the film has broad appeal to mainstream audiences, but it also has kind of encouraged people to enact change. So people have formed groups, and you know, they're fighting now to fight the issues that the characters in the 80s faced, which is incredible. And I think it kind of, you know, this was a story that was almost forgotten. Stephen Beresford, the screenwriter, heard it from his ex-partner in the early 90s, I believe it was, and little did he know, like he didn't believe it, but little did he know that every day he was walking by the People's History Museum on the way to work, which is actually where LGSM keep their archive, you know, like the original banner from the 80s and stuff like that. So that's quite incredible, really. And then I can't remember how he later went on to write the film, but it did take a long time to get written and to get, you know, to get made. I mean, a lot of people didn't think that a film about lesbians and gays supporting miners would
you could see it as being quite niche perhaps, but it's amazing that it's really not been, as you say. It's been so opening to other people and showing how it's so transferable to other issues.
Absolutely. And I think the release of the film was timely as well. Perhaps if the film had come out in the 90s, it wouldn't have quite had the same effect. You know, Britain going through deindustrialisation, kind of post-industrial mining communities not really seeing any hope for the future. But coming out now, I think the whole kind of process of mining communities facing closures of their mines gradually over the last 3 decades, it's kind of been like a grieving process. And you know, now communities, and not just communities of miners, but you know, all over Britain, working class communities, ethnic minorities, LGBT communities, anything like that, or any kind of minor community with an OR. Minor, they kind of use issues in the film as a way to kind of salvage something from the strike, and as a way to kind of turn that into something optimistic and active. And I think that's what the film is about.
So, I mean, as you said, it's had a really broad appeal and it's spurred people on to action. But, you know, did they know this was going to happen? Did they have this in mind? How did they market this film?
I don't think any of LGSM had any idea that the film would be this popular.
Yeah.
But it kind of, I mean, the way it was marketed, in America at least, the DVD release actually removed the lesbian and gay banner.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so they actually removed it, and it was quite controversial at the time, understandably. And it was basically kind of marketing it as a film about, you know, perhaps about minors, but kind of removing the LGBT plus aspect. So it's kind of, it kind of still shows how homophobia is still a big issue. Whilst it was a huge issue in the 80s relating to kind of a context of AIDS and kind of, you know, people being beaten up and stuff all the time, it's stuff like that, the fact that the film was marketed without its LGBT plus aspect being obvious, it kind of, it shows that we still have a way to go. Whilst, you know, the rights were pushed forward in the Labour manifesto in the 80s, it still shows there are still a lot of issues that, you know,
not there yet.
Yeah, exactly. Obviously, over the years, in 1994, you had the age of consent for same-sex couples, or at least men, you know, it wasn't really discussed with women, but for same-sex couples in 1994 it was reduced to 18 from 21, but it still wasn't the same age as, you know, heterosexual couples, which in 2001, you know, it was. So there seems to be this gradual process where it's kind of, things are changing and people are perhaps becoming more accepting, which is perhaps why Pride could be so successful now. Whereas, like I said about Billy Elliot and Full Monty, they kind of shoved any LGBT aspect under the carpet. But yeah, I mean, stuff like the marketing of the film kind of shows that we still have quite a way to go.
So what about, you know, going forward, what's the legacy of this film? What impact will this film have?
Well, a lot of the things that have happened in the film have kind of not so much been reenacted, but they've been used in terms of a present context. So for example, 2015 at London Pride, LGSM led the trade union block along with the miners who were in the film. They had the Tredegar brass band who were in the film as the brass band in there, and they were, you know, they were joined by a huge amount of supporters. Just, it was unbelievable, you know, like student groups, kind of like it was in the film. There was just all these different groups that were joining LGSM, and you kind of had the miners and LGSM themselves leading London Pride. That kind of happened again in that they were joined by groups and communities all over Britain, and not just Britain, but like places like Turkey and stuff like that as well. People came internationally to come and join LGSM in the march. So it kind of shows that whilst the issue is specifically related to something in the 80s, it's something that people relate to and identify with now because of the issues that it has with, you know, demonising of migrants and things like that. So the night before London Pride as well, there was a party, a Pints and Perverts party, it was named, and, you know, you had, it was rather incredible, you had all the songs from the film playing. So the songs that are in the film were playing, and it's this kind of, so obviously I was there, and it's this kind of bizarre aspect of something in the film and something from the past kind of having relevance now, but you know, it was incredible being there with LGSM, and Bronwyn Lewis was there, who sang Bread and Roses in the film. She gave a performance of that.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah, she sang the first verse alone, followed by the South Wales Gay Men's Choir joining in for the second verse, and then the entire room joining in for the third verse.
Oh, that would have been a fantastic experience.
Yeah, it was incredibly moving because obviously the scene in the film is something which is very powerful, and to have that in real life, it kind of brings these issues to the surface, and that, you know, solidarity and community should first and foremost be the primary factor in looking at how we kind of unite to defeat any kind of issues that are happening in contemporary Britain.
So this, you know, we're talking about this film in a timely manner for this year anyway, but this film is something that, you know, might not have been made and the story might not be remembered. It was very close to being forgotten.
Yeah, I mean, as I said before, kind of LGSM's personal archive and history, it was, you know, it's just kind of as Mike Jackson said before, he said that it was just kind of collecting dust in the People's History Museum in Manchester. So it's obviously the miners knew about it and LGSM knew about it and people kind of close to them did. But the film kind of has a legacy in that these events that have happened, kind of the London Pride and stuff like that, it's kind of given the film a legacy. So it's not about reenacting anything from the past or anything like that. It's about the legacy of the film, how the film itself and the issues within it have still got relevance to audiences today. And that's the primary thing about the film, I think. The fact that whilst it is a film about a story within 1984 to 1985, and a very specific story about that, it is still relevant to audiences today, and we can still carry on learning from it as we watch it.
Well, that's fantastic, and I do urge anyone who hasn't gone out to see this film to go and watch Pride, because as you say, it definitely has resonance today, and of course it's a lovely sort of reenactment of this historical moment. So thank you very much.